In the heart of America's most notorious correctional facilities, a war has raged for decades, one driven not just by power and survival, but by race, ideology, and territory. The battleground is stark: razor wire fences, locked down cell blocks, and exercise yards that look more like war zones than places of rehabilitation. Within this environment, the Nazi lowriders and the Nuestra Familia stand as bitter enemies, representing two very different sides of the prison gang spectrum. To understand their war, we first need to understand the stage upon which it's played. California's prison system is unlike any other in the United States. By the late 20th century, it had become the epicenter of prison gang politics. Inside, survival was dictated by race-based alliances. Whites, Latinos, and blacks each moved in carefully enforced lines, governed by invisible rules that dictated where they could sit, who they could associate with, and more importantly, who they could never cross. The racial segregation wasn't just a product of inmate culture. It was institutionalized by the environment itself. Prison officials kept groups apart, but in doing so, they reinforced the idea that each race was its own army. Within those armies, gangs rose to prominence, offering protection, structure, and, eventually, profit through crime. On the white side stood the Aryan Brotherhood, a small but deadly organization that wielded outsized power through fear and targeted violence. From the Brotherhood's shadow emerged a younger, more restless faction, the Nazi lowriders. Initially dismissed as nothing more than skinhead muscle, the NLR quickly evolved into a force in its own right, operating as the Aryan Brotherhood's soldiers, but carving out their own identity. They carried swastikas, iron crosses, and the language of white supremacy. But beneath the ideology was the hunger for money and control. Opposite them was a different kind of army. In the 1960s, the Nuestra Familia formed inside California's Soledad prison. Born from the need to protect Northern California's Latino inmates from the Mexican mafia, the NF developed into a disciplined, militarized organization. Unlike the chaotic violence of many prison gangs, the NF prided itself on structure, constitutions, chain of command, and strict codes of loyalty. They fought not just for survival, but for dominance, inside the walls and out on the streets of Northern California. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, these two organizations found themselves colliding. The NLR, fueled by racial hatred and backed by Aryan Brotherhood influence, viewed Latino gangs as natural enemies. The Nuestra Familia, entrenched in its own bloody war with the Mexican mafia, still found itself drawn into clashes with white gangs whenever power, drugs, or territory overlapped. This was no simple feud. It wasn't about two men with a personal grudge. It was about ideology versus identity. It was about who would control the drug pipelines flowing through prison yards and California neighborhoods. And it was about sending a message. In a place where survival meant allegiance, the wrong move could be fatal. The prison gates closed, but the war inside was only beginning. The Nazi lowriders, known simply as the NLR, did not begin as the feared syndicate they would later become. In the 1970s, they were little more than a ragtag group of young white inmates and street punks orbiting the shadow of the Aryan Brotherhood, America's most infamous white prison gang. Where the Brotherhood operated like generals, careful, calculating, and selective, the NLR were the infantry, disposable soldiers who could carry out orders, collect debts, and handle the dirty work. But from these humble, violent beginnings, the NLR found a way to evolve. Originally, the Aryan Brotherhood had kept their numbers intentionally small. The idea was exclusivity. Only the most ruthless and loyal white inmates were chosen. But this exclusivity left a gap. A large population of young, angry white inmates who needed affiliation, protection, and purpose. The Nazi lowriders filled that vacuum. They were not yet equals to the Aryan Brotherhood, but they were indispensable. The NLR quickly developed their own style of brutality. They leaned heavily on skinhead culture, borrowing from the white supremacist gangs on the streets of Southern California. Bald heads, swastika tattoos, and iron crosses became their calling cards. Violence was their initiation, and reputation was everything. While ideology gave them a banner to rally behind, their true rise came from crime and profit. In prisons, they acted as enforcers. On the streets, they became drug traffickers, carjackers, and extortionists. Their networks stretched from correctional facilities into neighborhoods across Southern California. Methamphetamine, in particular, became the currency of their rise. The NLR were feared not just for their racism, but for their unpredictability. They would attack without hesitation, leaving bloody warnings in their wake. Law enforcement began to notice the shift. By the early 1990s, the NLR were no longer just youngsters under Aryan Brotherhood command. They were establishing their own identity, complete with leadership hierarchies, codes of conduct, and strict loyalty rules. Membership required proof of commitment, often sealed in blood. Inside prison, their presence was unmistakable. They aligned themselves closely with the Aryan Brotherhood, but were far more visible. NLR soldiers were often the ones fighting on the front lines in racial riots, clashing with Black and Latino gangs in the yard. Their numbers gave them strength, and their reputation for violence gave them power. But their expansion also painted a target on their backs. For every alliance they built with white gangs, they earned enemies elsewhere. And in California's prisons, the natural enemy of a white supremacist gang was clear: the Latino organizations that dominated vast stretches of the system. The NLR's rise was meteoric, but it was also reckless. While the Aryan Brotherhood played chess, moving pieces carefully, the Nazi lowriders played something more like Russian roulette. Always violent, always one move away from disaster. And as their power grew, so did the number of wars they would have to fight. Soon they would collide head-on with one of the most structured, disciplined, and ruthless Latino forces in the prison system: the Nuestra Familia. In the late 1960s, California's prison yards were dominated by fear. And for Latino inmates from Northern California, that fear had a name: La M, the Mexican Mafia. The Mafia had already established itself as the ruthless overseer of Southern California's Latino population. They controlled contraband, enforced discipline, and punished anyone who refused to pay tribute. But in this rigid hierarchy, inmates from the agricultural valleys and small towns of the North were treated as outsiders, lesser, expendable, and often abused. It was within this environment that a resistance movement took form. In 1968, inside Soledad Prison, a new organization was born: La Nuestra Familia, the Our Family. Unlike the Mexican Mafia, which prided itself on exclusivity and intimidation, the Nuestra Familia positioned itself as a protector of Northern California's Latino inmates. They offered something La M could not: safety and solidarity for those who had long been marginalized. But what began as protection quickly evolved into something larger. The NF adopted a military-style structure that set it apart from other gangs. Members operated under a written constitution. There were generals, captains, lieutenants, and foot soldiers. Orders flowed down the chain of command with precision, and obedience was absolute. In a world where chaos reigned, the Nuestra Familia thrived on discipline. Their primary enemy was clear: the Mexican Mafia. The war between norteños and sureños, between NF and LM, would define California's prison politics for decades. But in the process, the Nuestra Familia grew into a power that could not be ignored by any group, including the white gangs. The NF's influence stretched beyond prison walls. Street gangs in Northern California adopted the red color and the number 14, a reference to the 14th letter of the alphabet, N for Norte. This created an endless supply of recruits ready to enter the prison system, already loyal to the cause. Unlike many gangs that stumbled through disorganization, the NF had a pipeline of soldiers feeding directly into its ranks. Their discipline extended to money. The NF built a reputation for running highly organized drug trafficking and extortion operations. Each regiment outside prison sent profits back to incarcerated leaders, creating a steady revenue stream. Failure to pay, whether on the streets or behind bars, meant death. But perhaps the most defining feature of the NF was its ideological identity. Members swore lifelong allegiance. They considered themselves part of a revolutionary struggle, not just a gang. Betrayal was punished more harshly than by any other group. Death was the only sentence for those who turned against the family. By the 1980s and 1990s, the NF had become one of the most feared and respected organizations in the California prison system. They were not just a gang. They were an institution. And while their main war was always with the Mexican Mafia, their militant structure meant they clashed with anyone who threatened their control, including the white gangs rising in power. This collision was inevitable. The Nazi lowriders, violent and unpredictable, would soon find themselves standing opposite an army unlike any other, the disciplined soldiers of the Nuestra Familia. Inside California's prisons, alliances are not chosen, they are imposed. The yard is a chessboard divided by race, and every inmate is a piece on the board. Whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, each group eats at different tables, showers at different times, and occupies different corners of the yard. To cross those invisible boundaries is to invite suspicion. To ignore them is to invite death. It is within this segregated world that the Nazi lowriders and the Nuestra Familia existed. Two organizations forged in conflict, now locked in a struggle not only for power, but for survival. Their rivalry was not just about drugs, money, or territory, though those were vital pieces. At its core, it was about ideology colliding with identity. For the Nazi lowriders, ideology was the unifying banner. Their tattoos told the story: swastikas, iron crosses, SS lightning bolts. They prided themselves on white supremacy, a belief that fueled hatred toward all other groups, especially Latinos and blacks. This ideology gave them purpose, a sense of belonging in a hostile environment. It was not just about survival, it was about domination. For the Nuestra Familia, identity was the cornerstone. They did not rally around abstract ideology, but around a shared heritage and a common enemy. To be from Northern California, to be oppressed by the Mexican Mafia, was enough to bind members together. Their loyalty was not to an idea, but to a cause, protecting and empowering Northern Latinos. Their red bandanas and the number 14 became emblems of defiance and unity. But ideology and identity inevitably clashed. In the stark racial politics of prison life, the NLR saw Latinos as natural enemies, while the NF saw white supremacists as existential threats. Every meal in the chow hall, every movement on the yard became a potential spark for violence. What made this conflict even more dangerous were the alliances. The Nazi lowriders, tied to the Aryan Brotherhood, often stood alongside white gangs. The Nuestra Familia, though deeply focused on their war with the Mexican mafia, sometimes found themselves allied with black gangs, such as the Black Guerrilla family, in broader racial struggles. This meant that fights were rarely isolated. A clash between two members could spiral into a full-scale racial riot. And while both groups used ideology and identity as shields, underneath it all was the same motivation: control of the drug trade. Drugs were currency in prison, buying influence, protection, and power. Whoever controlled the flow of narcotics inside controlled the politics of the yard. For the NLR, methamphetamine was their stronghold. For the NF, heroin and cocaine often funded their regiments. Ideology and identity gave the war its narrative, but drugs gave it fuel. For the men caught in the middle, survival meant choosing a side. Neutrality was not an option. In California's prisons, to walk alone was to walk unprotected, and protection always came with a price. The stage was set. Two armies divided by race, driven by different philosophies, but locked in the same deadly struggle for dominance. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the simmering tensions between the Nazi lowriders and the Nuestra Familia began boiling over. In California's overcrowded prisons, space was tight, resources scarce, and alliances tested daily. The smallest disputes, a stare, a disrespectful word, a rumor of stolen commissary, could ignite into violence. But when those sparks fell between organized gangs, the result was full-scale warfare. The Nazi lowriders, emboldened by their growing numbers and their backing from the Aryan Brotherhood, began testing their strength against Latino gangs across the system. The Nuestra Familia, entrenched in its war with the Mexican mafia, still found itself repeatedly clashing with white gangs whenever racial lines were crossed. And the NLR, known for their reckless violence, crossed those lines often. Riots erupted in facilities like Folsom, Pelican Bay, and Corcoran, where the NF and NLR were both housed. These weren't random fights, they were orchestrated. Each group operated under a green light system. When leadership declared an enemy green lit, soldiers had full permission to attack on sight. That meant an NLR member could be stabbed in the chow hall for no reason other than being on Nuestra Familia's list. The reverse was just as true. The weapons were crude but effective. Shanks carved from toothbrushes, melted plastic, or scraps of metal. Attacks were fast and brutal, designed not just to injure, but to send a message. In one infamous clash, a small argument in the yard spiraled into a full-scale melee, dozens of inmates rushing from both sides, blood pooling on the concrete before guards could regain control. The aftermath left several hospitalized and both gangs on permanent lockdown. But violence inside the walls didn't stay contained. Orders flowed outward. On the streets of Northern California and Southern California, affiliated street gangs carried out retaliations that mirrored the prison wars. NLR members on parole enforced white dominance in their neighborhoods, while Norteño street soldiers, loyal to the NF, struck back when they crossed paths. What made these clashes so explosive was the unpredictability of the NLR. The Aryan Brotherhood was strategic, often holding back until the moment was right. The NF was disciplined, carrying out violence only under orders. But the Nazi lowriders? They thrived on chaos. Younger members, eager to prove themselves, would launch attacks without authorization, forcing the NF to respond with deadly precision. One stabbing could set off weeks of retaliations, each more vicious than the last. Correctional officers described the yards during this period as powder kegs. Every movement required watchful eyes from guard towers. Shotguns were cocked, tear gas at the ready. A single wrong move during yard time could trigger an eruption that left bodies scattered on the ground. As the bloodshed mounted, one thing became clear. This was no longer just about race or ideology. It was about power, and neither side was willing to back down. The first clashes had escalated into open war. Behind every stabbing, every riot, and every retaliatory hit lay the true engine of the conflict, the drug trade. California's prisons were not just cages for violent men. They were command centers. From inside solitary cells and lockdown units, gang leaders issued orders that shaped the flow of narcotics on both sides of the prison walls. Whoever controlled the drugs controlled the politics, and whoever controlled the politics controlled survival. For the Nazi lowriders, methamphetamine was king. Their ties to white supremacist networks in Southern California gave them access to labs and street dealers who flooded neighborhoods with crank. On the streets, NLR members were known for their ruthlessness in collecting debts, extorting small-time dealers, and muscling their way into the meth market. Inside prison, they used that street money to buy influence, paying off guards, securing contraband, and rewarding loyal soldiers. The Nuestra Familia, by contrast, had a broader criminal empire. Their regiments outside prison were heavily invested in heroin and cocaine, with street-level norteño gangs funneling profits directly back into the prison system. Each regiment was required to send a tax known as the quota up the chain of command. This money sustained incarcerated leaders, purchased weapons, and funded further drug smuggling operations. The conflict wasn't just about who could move drugs, but who could control distribution inside prison. When a shipment of heroin or meth was smuggled past the guards, it didn't simply enter a neutral marketplace. It became contested property. The NF wanted a cut. The NLR demanded control, and when neither side was willing to share, violence followed. Prison investigators began noticing a pattern. Major riots often coincided with disputes over narcotics. An unpaid debt of a few grams could spiral into a stabbing that set off weeks of bloodshed. Guards intercepted kites, tiny notes passed between inmates that revealed coded instructions for drug collections and hit lists. The message was always the same: money equals power. But power struggles weren't limited to drugs alone. Both groups demanded taxes and tributes from inmates under their racial umbrellas. For the NF, every norteño gang member on the street was expected to contribute. For the NLR, every white inmate was pressured into allegiance, or at least submission. Refusal meant being green-lit. In prison culture, that was a death sentence. This extortion created tension even among their own people. Some inmates resented paying taxes. Others saw no choice. But for the leadership, control of revenue streams was non-negotiable. It was the lifeline that allowed them to outlast lockdowns, fund legal defenses, and keep their soldiers armed and loyal. The drug trade made the gangs richer, but it also made them more dangerous. Violence was no longer random or reactive. It became strategic. Every hit, every riot, every alliance had money at its core. For the NLR and the NF, the drug economy wasn't just business, it was war. And with profits soaring, neither side would back down. As the bloodshed between the Nazi lowriders and the Nuestra Familia intensified, law enforcement could no longer ignore the scale of the war. What began as isolated prison riots had evolved into a sprawling criminal enterprise, one that reached from California's maximum security yards to small towns and city streets. Both gangs had built empires on drugs, extortion, and violence, and authorities were determined to dismantle them. The first line of defense was within the prisons themselves. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, employed a controversial strategy: the Security Housing Unit, or SHU. Facilities like Pelican Bay became notorious for their isolation wings, where confirmed gang members were locked away 23 hours a day in small concrete cells. The goal was simple: cut off gang leaders from their soldiers. But even in solitary confinement, the orders kept flowing. Smuggled kites, coded letters, and corrupt staff ensured that communication lines remained open. It became clear that punishment alone wasn't enough. The gangs had adapted too well to life behind walls. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement agencies shifted their approach. They began targeting the gangs as organized crime syndicates, not just loose collections of violent inmates. The FBI, DEA, and state task forces launched sweeping investigations using RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This allowed prosecutors to treat every act of violence, every drug deal, and every act of extortion as part of a larger conspiracy. The Nazi lowriders were among the first to face this pressure. Their reputation as the Aryan Brotherhood's farm team made them a priority target. Federal agents documented meth pipelines stretching across Southern California, linking NLR members inside prison to street-level suppliers. Dozens of members were indicted, facing decades-long sentences that gutted parts of their structure. The Nuestra Familia, however, was a larger and more deeply entrenched organization. In 2000, Operation Black Widow became one of the most ambitious law enforcement campaigns in California history. Using wiretaps, undercover informants, and flipped gang members, the FBI built cases against NF generals and regiment leaders. Dozens were indicted on charges ranging from murder to drug trafficking. For a time, it seemed the NF's hierarchy had been shattered. But crackdowns often had unintended consequences. With older leaders locked down or removed, younger, more volatile members rose to power. Fragmentation sometimes made the gangs even harder to control, as splinter factions carried out violence without the restraint of disciplined leadership. In other cases, imprisoned leaders continued to run operations from their cells, proving that incarceration was no barrier to influence. Law enforcement's battle against these gangs was, and remains, a war of attrition. Each indictment, each transfer to a supermax facility, each lockdown is meant to weaken the organizations. Yet the cycle often repeats: new recruits step in, old grudges reignite, and the machinery of violence grinds on. The crackdowns expose just how powerful and resilient the Nazi lowriders and the Nuestra Familia had become. And while law enforcement scored victories, the question remained: could they ever truly dismantle the gangs, or were they only cutting off the heads of hydras that would always grow back?